The corner of Fifth and Maple buzzed with the late afternoon sounds of Elmridge. Mason Monroe, leaning slightly on his folded cane, waited with a calm that contrasted sharply with the busy sidewalks. People passed by, glancing at the boy with curiosity or indifference, but Mason hardly noticed. He was deeply aware of his surroundings, picking up on the different tones of voices, footsteps, and even the distant bark of a dog. His dad, Henry Monroe, had promised to pick him up after work, and Mason was used to waiting there. But today felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on why. "Hey, kid!" A voice broke through the noise. The tone was cold and sharp, carrying a sense of authority that felt invasive rather than protective. Mason tightened his grip on the cane. He didn't recognize the voice, but he knew enough from the tone to be wary. "Yes," he replied, turning slightly towards where the voice had come from. The man stepped closer, his heavy boots landing with deliberate, intimidating thuds. "What's a blind kid doing hanging around here alone?" The officer didn't bother hiding his disdain. Mason felt his chest tighten, but he held his ground. "Waiting for my dad." The man scoffed. "Your dad's okay with you out here in the middle of the city alone? Must be real confident, letting a kid like you wander around." Mason's jaw tightened. He'd been taught to stand up for himself, to be proud of his independence. But this felt different, more hostile. "I'm fine. I know where I am." "Oh, really?" The officer, Garrett Miller, tilted his head, smirking. "I bet you don't even know who you're talking to." Mason shifted his weight, feeling exposed. He forced himself to speak evenly. "No, sir, I don't." Garrett's voice dropped. "Well, I'm Officer Garrett Miller, and I think kids like you should be more careful where they wait." Not everyone's understanding. Just as Garrett's sneer settled in, Mason heard a familiar set of footsteps approaching. Relief washed over him as his father's presence filled the air. "Is there a problem here, Officer Miller?" Henry's voice was calm but laced with steel. He placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, grounding him, then directed a gaze at Garrett that could have frozen fire. Garrett quickly plastered on a half-hearted smile. "Just doing my job, Commissioner. Making sure the kid's safe." Henry's eyes narrowed. "My son is safe, and I don't recall asking anyone to check on him." There was a tense pause, each man sizing the other up. Garrett was the first to break eye contact, stepping back, though the defiance in his voice lingered. "Well, like I said, just doing my job." Henry didn't respond immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on Garrett until the officer finally turned and walked away. He waited until Garrett was out of sight before he spoke again. "You okay, son?" Henry's voice softened as he turned to Mason, his hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder. Mason nodded, though he kept his face stoic. "Yeah, Dad. I'm fine." Henry's silence was thick with unspoken tension. He'd worked too long, seen too much to ignore what he just witnessed. But he knew Mason needed strength more than outrage. After a few moments, he sighed. "Come on, let's go home." The ride home was quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the car engine. Mason sensed his father's mood, the way Henry's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line. As they pulled into their driveway, Mason broke the silence. "You're mad at him, aren't you?" Henry paused before answering. "It's not about being mad, Mason. It's about principles." He turned to face his son, his voice gentle but firm. "No one has the right to treat you, or anyone, like that." Mason nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I know, Dad, but I don't want you to get into trouble because of me." Henry's expression softened. "Mason, you're never a reason for trouble. Remember that." They entered the house, and Henry's mind was already turning over the next steps. Garrett's arrogance had crossed a line, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. Later that evening, as Henry sat alone in his study, a knock on the door brought him out of his thoughts. It was Sarah Ramirez, his trusted detective and ally. She gave him a nod and closed the door behind her, leaning against it with a concerned look. "I heard about what happened with Garrett," she said quietly, crossing her arms. "You okay?" Henry ran a hand over his face. "Okay enough. But that man crossed a line, Sarah, and I can't let it slide." Sarah nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. "You're not alone in this. I've had my suspicions about Garrett for a while now. He's careless, and he hides it under that badge. Henry met her gaze, gratitude and frustration swirling in his eyes. I want this done right, Sarah. Not just for Mason, but for everyone. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. Then let's start digging. The next day, as Henry arrived at the precinct, he was met with Garrett's smug expression. Garrett leaned against the wall near the entrance, waiting as if he'd been anticipating Henry's arrival. "Morning, Commissioner," Garrett drawled, his smile insolent. Henry gave him a curt nod, suppressing the urge to confront him in front of everyone. "Good morning, Officer Miller." Garrett took a slow step closer, his voice dropping so only Henry could hear. "You know, it's easy for people like you to lose perspective. Easy to forget where you came from." Henry's eyes narrowed, the calm exterior barely holding. "I remember exactly where I came from, Garrett. And I remember why I'm here." Garrett's smirk deepened. "We'll see about that." Without another word, Henry walked away, every step fueling his resolve. As he reached his office, Sarah was already there, a stack of files on her desk and an expression that said she meant business. "We have a lot of work to do," she said without preamble, gesturing for him to sit. Henry's lips tightened into a grim line. "Then let's not waste any time." Each interaction, each quiet but powerful exchange, only served to solidify the path Henry knew he had to take. It was clear that exposing Garrett wouldn't be simple. It would require strategy, patience, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. The early morning light barely seeped through the narrow windows of the Elmridge precinct as Henry sat alone in his office, reviewing a pile of old complaints. His face was set in hard lines, his fingers tapping absently on the edge of a faded report. Each page he turned revealed more of Garrett Miller's history: excessive force, citizen complaints, ignored warnings. It was all there, buried beneath stacks of paperwork. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Ramirez entered, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Morning, Sarah," he said, without looking up. "Morning, Commissioner." She approached his desk and glanced down at the reports. "You've been here all night, haven't you?" Henry gave a slight nod. "Couldn't let it go. It's worse than I thought. Garrett's been doing this for years, and nobody's held him accountable." She took a seat, leaning forward. "I've had my suspicions, you know. Garrett's a tough one to pin down. People are either too afraid or too indifferent to take a stand." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "But we can't let it slide anymore. If he's willing to target Mason, who knows who else he's intimidated, humiliated." Sarah's eyes softened. "I'm with you, Henry. Whatever it takes. He can't keep hiding behind that badge." A silence hung between them as they shared a look of mutual understanding. The fight would be difficult. Garrett wasn't just any officer. He was respected by some, feared by others, and the risk of backlash was high. Just then, a light rapping on the door interrupted them. It was Garrett himself, his face wearing that signature smugness. "Good morning, Commissioner." Detective Ramirez, he greeted them, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Henry's face hardened, but he managed a curt nod. "Officer Miller, to what do we owe the pleasure?" Garrett shrugged nonchalantly. "Just thought I'd check in. I heard you've been busy, Henry. Up late digging through old files." "That's dedication." Sarah tensed, her eyes narrowing. "Last I checked, it's part of the job. We have a duty to look into patterns." Garrett smiled, his eyes fixed on Henry. "I'd be careful if I were you, Henry. Sometimes digging too deep just gets your hands dirty." Henry felt a surge of anger, but he held it back, meeting Garrett's gaze with calm intensity. "And sometimes, Garrett, it brings the truth to light. You'd know a lot about that, wouldn't you?" A flicker of something unreadable crossed Garrett's face before he regained his composure, his voice smooth but with an edge. "Just remember, Commissioner, it's a slippery slope. Don't want to lose sight of who's really on your side." As Garrett turned to leave, he threw one last look over his shoulder. "See you around, Henry. And remember, some people around here appreciate loyalty." The door clicked shut, and the tension in the room felt like it could snap. Sarah shook her head. "He's on to us, Henry." If he suspects anything, I know, Henry interrupted, his voice resolute, but that won't stop me. If Garrett thinks his reputation will save him, he's in for a rude awakening. Later that day, Henry and Sarah pored over more files, going through each complaint meticulously. As they worked, Sarah spoke up. You know, she said, flipping a page, there's a community event in a few days. Garrett's scheduled to make an appearance. Henry frowned. Why would they want him representing the department? She shrugged. It's not uncommon for him to try and boost his image when things get shaky. Last year, he even organized a charity event for some local kids. It worked. People started to see him as a hero again. Henry clenched his jaw. That might explain why he's untouchable. He's built a facade, one good enough that nobody questions him. Sarah met his gaze. But we're questioning him now, and that's enough. As the precinct quieted down that evening, Henry prepared to head home, his mind weighed down with the day's discoveries. On his way out, he caught sight of Garrett laughing with a few other officers, the sound grating on his nerves. He approached just close enough to overhear their conversation. People just don't understand what it takes to keep order, Garrett was saying, his tone confident, almost bragging. Sometimes, you have to get a little creative. One of the younger officers laughed, glancing at Garrett with a mix of awe and respect. Guess that's why you're still here, huh? Garrett smirked. Exactly. You do what's necessary. Some of these higher-ups, they've forgotten what real policing is about. Henry's fists tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. There was no use confronting Garrett in front of his loyalists. Instead, he turned away, his resolve deepening. As he left the building, Sarah caught up with him. Henry, I overheard them. Garrett's not just arrogant, he's dangerous. He's got these guys convinced that he's untouchable. Henry nodded. But he's not. Tomorrow, we start interviewing people who filed complaints against him. If we can find even one person willing to talk. Sarah's face broke into a determined smile. Then we've got something. Let's bring him down, Henry. The following day was a blur of calls, meetings, and hushed conversations. One after another, they contacted citizens who had filed complaints against Garrett. Most were hesitant, some even fearful, but one woman, Patricia Hall, agreed to come in. Sitting across from Henry and Sarah, Patricia looked down, nervously wringing her hands. Thank you for coming, Ms. Hall, Henry said gently. We know this is difficult, but we need to understand what happened when you filed your complaint. Patricia's voice shook slightly. I didn't think anyone would ever take it seriously. When I reported Garrett, they told me it was protocol and that I should just move on. Sarah leaned forward. Ms. Hall, we're here to make sure this time it's not brushed aside. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened? Patricia's eyes filled with tears. He pulled me over for a broken taillight. But he was digressive, called me names, humiliated me, like he enjoyed it. I told him I'd report him, and he just laughed, said no one would believe me. Henry's fists clenched under the table, and no one did. Until now. Patricia nodded, relief evident on her face. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her arm. It won't. We're doing everything we can. After Patricia left, Henry sat in silence, the weight of it all sinking in. Sarah broke the silence, her voice quiet but fierce. We need to keep going. She's just one of many, Henry. We can't stop now. Henry nodded, his resolve only hardening. Tomorrow, we keep digging. Garrett's days of hiding are over. Their investigation gained momentum, each new piece of evidence adding fuel to the fire. But Henry knew that Garrett was just as determined to protect his reputation, no matter the cost. And with each passing day, the stakes grew higher, the risks more dangerous. But for Henry, there was no turning back. Not now. Henry sat in his office, hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the door as he prepared himself for what was to come. He'd called Garrett in, intending to confront him directly. Henry knew it was a risk, but he also knew that if he didn't take a stand now, Garrett's behavior would continue unchecked. A sharp knock sounded on the door, and Garrett entered, his expression already defensive, arms crossed over his chest. He took a seat without waiting for an invitation, his smirk barely concealed. "So, Commissioner," Garrett began, leaning back, "I heard you wanted to have a little chat." Henry kept his gaze steady, refusing to rise to the bait. "Yes, Garrett. It's time we address your conduct." Garrett rolled his eyes, feigning innocence. "My conduct? I'm just doing my job, Henry. Maybe it's you who's forgotten what that looks like." Henry's jaw tightened. "You call intimidation doing your job? Targeting civilians, humiliating my son? That's not the job, Garrett. That's abuse." Garrett's eyes flashed, and he leaned forward, his tone dropping to a low snarl. "You're out of line, Henry. Just because you've got the commissioner's title doesn't mean you're untouchable. Maybe you've forgotten that." Henry met his stare, unflinching. "This isn't about me, Garrett. This is about accountability, something you seem to have no concept of. I've seen the complaints, the testimonies. I know what you've been doing." A tense silence settled between them. Garrett's smirk faded, replaced by something colder. "You really think you can scare me, Henry?" he sneered. "I've been doing this long enough to know exactly how things work around here. And trust me, no one's going to listen to a few complaints." Henry leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I'm done letting you get away with this. Either you shape up, or you'll answer for every single thing you've done." Garrett laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Good luck with that. Because I'm not the only one around here who thinks you've lost your way. You might be surprised by how many people are on my side." With that, he stood and walked out, leaving Henry alone with a pounding heart and clenched fists. He knew Garrett was right. The man had allies within the precinct, officers who admired his forceful methods. Henry's fight was only just beginning. As the days passed, Garrett's influence became more apparent. Rumors circulated, whispers that Henry was targeting one of his own, that he was more loyal to his title than to his colleagues. A toxic tension filled the precinct, and Henry felt the weight of it every time he walked into the building. Sarah noticed it too. One afternoon, as they sat together in the briefing room going over more complaints, she shook her head. "They're talking about you, Henry. Saying you're turning on your own men." Henry exhaled, his gaze drifting to the reports in front of him. "Let them talk, Sarah. I'm not here to win a popularity contest. Garrett's behavior has gone unchecked for too long." She nodded, but her brow remained furrowed. "I get it, but the others, some of them are starting to see him as a victim. He's playing the part well." A humorless smile crept onto Henry's face. "Of course he is. That's what he does. Manipulates people into thinking he's the good guy." Just then, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside the door. Henry and Sarah exchanged a look before standing and heading out into the hallway, where a small group of officers had gathered. Garrett was at the center of the group, speaking in a loud, impassioned tone. "This department used to stand for something," he said, his voice carrying. "But now, we're being led by someone who'd rather take the side of strangers than his own men." Some of the officers murmured in agreement, nodding along. Garrett's gaze flicked to Henry, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "If any of you have a problem with the way I'm running things, I suggest you take it up with me directly. I'm more than willing to listen to concerns." Garrett smirked, crossing his arms. "Maybe that's the problem, Henry. You're always listening to everyone else, but never to us." Henry's gaze remained steady. "Listening is exactly what makes us effective, Garrett. We're here to serve everyone, not just ourselves." Garrett's face twisted with contempt. "Keep telling yourself that. But don't be surprised if you find yourself on your own before long." Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. "My duty is to this department and this city. I'll do what's right, no matter who's with me." With that, he turned and walked away, though he could feel the weight of their stares on his back. The division within the ranks was growing, and he knew he had to act before Garrett's influence tore the department apart. That evening, at home, Henry noticed the tension in Mason's face as he quietly moved through the kitchen. Normally upbeat, Mason was uncharacteristically silent, his expression guarded. "Mason," Henry began, leaning against the counter. "Something on your mind?" Mason hesitated, then nodded slowly. Some kids at school, they were saying things. About you. About me. Henry felt a surge of protectiveness. What did they say? Mason shrugged, his voice low. That you're going after someone, a good cop, who was just doing his job. They said I should be ashamed, that I'm making things harder for everyone. Henry clenched his fists, anger and hurt flashing through him. He crossed the room and placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. Mason, listen to me. None of this is your fault. Garrett is not a good cop, no matter what people think. And I'm doing this because it's right. Mason looked up, his expression uncertain. But what if everyone hates us, Dad? What if no one understands? Henry's gaze softened, and he wrapped his arms around his son. Sometimes, doing the right thing means standing alone. But I promise you, Mason, we're not alone. And as long as we have each other, we're strong enough to face anything. Mason hugged him tightly, drawing strength from his father's embrace. They stayed like that for a long moment, the silence filled with unspoken understanding and determination. The next day, Henry and Sarah sat down to review their findings. After days of interviews, reports, and testimonies, they finally had enough evidence to act. But they knew they needed more than just documents to make their case. We need something undeniable, Sarah said, tapping her fingers against the table. Something that will force everyone to see who Garrett really is. Henry nodded. A witness. Someone who's willing to speak out, even if it's risky. They made more calls, reaching out to individuals who had crossed paths with Garrett. After several hours, they managed to find a former officer who'd left the force due to Garrett's harassment. His name was Marcus Lee, a retired sergeant who had once been one of the most respected members of the precinct. Later that afternoon, Marcus arrived at the precinct, his posture straight but his face lined with years of struggle. Henry greeted him with a firm handshake. Thank you for coming, Marcus. I know this isn't easy. Marcus nodded, his expression grave. I left because of Garrett. I couldn't stay in a place where that kind of behavior was allowed. But if I can help bring him down, I'm in. They led him to the interview room, where he gave his account, detailing the years of bullying, intimidation, and manipulation Garrett had subjected him to. By the time he finished, Henry and Sarah knew they finally had a weapon strong enough to cut through Garrett's lies. As Marcus prepared to leave, he looked Henry in the eyes. He's got people who'll stand by him, Henry. But I know you. I know you're stronger than he is. Don't let him win. Henry nodded, a fierce resolve burning in his gaze. I won't. Thank you, Marcus. We'll make this right. Marcus's words echoed in Henry's mind long after he'd left, and he knew that Garrett's reckoning was only just beginning. Henry and Sarah sat side by side in the dimly lit precinct office, watching the video that had been sent to them anonymously. The grainy footage showed Garrett approaching a young man on the street, taunting him in a tone so degrading it made Sarah's skin crawl. Then came the part they'd been waiting for, the footage of Garrett's confrontation with Mason. Garrett's voice oozed contempt, mocking Mason's blindness, clearly reveling in his power. As the video ended, Henry exhaled slowly, feeling a profound weight on his chest. This is it, he murmured, barely audible. Sarah's eyes met his, filled with determination. This is exactly what we needed. We make this public and he's done. Henry's gaze sharpened, and he nodded. But this won't be easy. Garrett's got allies, people who'll defend him no matter what. They'll try to discredit the video. Sarah shook her head. Let them try. The footage speaks for itself. Once this is out, he won't have anywhere to hide. They exchanged a long, resolute look before Henry made the call to the press. Within hours, the video was in the hands of a local reporter who promised to air it that evening. Henry knew the backlash could be severe, but he was ready. The evening news came on, and soon the footage of Garrett's actions was playing across Elmridge. People in homes, bars, and cafes watched, shocked by what they saw. The story exploded, sparking a wave of anger and disbelief. At the precinct, Garrett stormed into Henry's office, his face red with fury. You did this, didn't you? You think you can just destroy my career with some setup? Henry stood up, meeting Garrett's gaze with unshakable resolve. This wasn't a setup, Garrett. This was justice. You made those choices, not me. Garrett's hands balled into fists at his sides. I won't go down for this, Henry. I've given years to this department. You think you're the only one who cares about this city? I think there's a difference between caring for a city and abusing the people in it, Henry replied evenly. Your time's up. Garrett's voice dropped, his tone venomous. You think this is over? People out there still believe in me. I've got support. They know I'm being targeted. Henry didn't flinch. Then let them watch the video. Let them see who you really are. Garrett laughed bitterly. And you think you're any better? A commissioner turning on his own men? Who's the real traitor here? Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. This isn't about loyalty, Garrett. It's about integrity. Something you clearly don't understand. Garrett glared at her, then turned his eyes back to Henry. You're making a big mistake. When this department starts crumbling because you turned it into a circus, don't come crying to me. Without waiting for a response, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. The weight of Garrett's words lingered, but he knew this was the right path. The fallout was swift. The next day, the precinct was filled with hushed voices and sideways glances. Some officers were openly supportive of Garrett, accusing Henry of betrayal, while others stayed silent, avoiding the growing tension. At one point, Officer Daniels, an older cop with decades on the force, approached Henry. Commissioner, I've been here a long time, Daniels began, a hint of hesitation in his voice. And I don't agree with everything Garrett's done. But was this really necessary? Going public like that? Henry looked him in the eye. Daniels, I respect your years of service. But protecting someone like Garrett, it goes against everything this badge stands for. He hurt people who trusted us. Daniels sighed, scratching his head. Maybe, but now you've put the whole department under scrutiny. You're going to face a lot of backlash, sir. Henry's expression was resolute. If that's the price for doing the right thing, then I'll pay it. Daniels studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. I hope you're right, Commissioner. For all our sakes. That evening, Henry arrived home to find Mason sitting on the couch, his face tight with worry. Dad, Mason started hesitantly. I heard what happened on the news. About the video. Henry sat down beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I know, son, and I know this has been hard on you. Mason's voice was quiet. People at school, they're saying things. Some of them are angry. They think I caused all this. Henry's heart ached for his son, but his voice remained steady. Mason, listen to me. None of this is your fault. Garrett's actions are his own, and he's facing the consequences. You were brave to stand up that day. You did nothing wrong. Mason nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. I just don't want you to get in trouble, Dad. I know this is big. Henry pulled him into a hug. I won't let that happen. I promise. We're doing the right thing, and in the end, that's all that matters. Mason hugged him tightly, and for a moment, Henry allowed himself to feel the comfort of his son's strength. The following day, Garrett's supporters organized a rally in the town square, painting him as the victim of an unjust vendetta. Signs with slogans like "Support our cops" and "Commissioner Betrayer" waved in the crowd. Garrett took the stage, looking as though he'd prepared for this moment his entire life. Good citizens of Elmridge, he began, his voice carrying a note of practiced humility. I stand here today not as a victim, but as a man who has given everything for this city. I've worked to protect it, to keep our streets safe, and now I'm being punished for it. The crowd erupted in applause, and Garrett's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. But I won't let this stop me, he continued. I'm here because I believe in justice, in loyalty to the badge, and I won't let one man's agenda destroy what we've built. As he spoke, Sarah and Henry stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the spectacle. Sarah's expression was grim. He's playing them perfectly. This is exactly what he wanted. A rally to boost his image. Henry's gaze was fixed on Garrett. Let him have his moment. The truth is out now, and that's something he can't hide from. The rally continued, but Henry felt a quiet confidence take root within him. The city had seen the footage, and no amount of rhetoric could change the truth. The next morning, Henry was called into a meeting with the mayor and several council members. As he entered the room, he felt the tension, sensing that he was walking into a lion's den. The mayor leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. "Henry, you've put us in a difficult position. This scandal is making waves, and people are questioning the department's integrity." Henry met her gaze steadily. "With all due respect, Mayor, this scandal isn't because of me. It's because of Garrett Miller's actions. I'm doing what's necessary to restore trust." A councilman shook his head, frustration etched on his face. "But you've jeopardized our image. A video like that, it damages public confidence." "Only if we let it," Henry replied. "The people of Elmridge need to see that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. That's how we earn their trust back." The mayor sighed, clearly torn. This may cost you, Henry. You realize that?" Henry nodded. "I do. But if that's what it takes to do what's right, then so be it." The room fell silent as the council members exchanged uneasy glances, but Henry knew he'd spoken the truth. They dismissed him shortly after, leaving him with a sense of both relief and resignation. Returning to the precinct, Henry found Sarah waiting for him, her eyes questioning. "How did it go?" Henry managed a small smile. "As well as could be expected. They're worried about the department's image, but they know we did what we had to." Sarah nodded, relief evident on her face. "And Garrett?" Henry's gaze hardened. "He's not going to give up easily, but we've taken away his power. The city has seen the truth, and he can't erase that." Just then, a junior officer rushed over, breathless. "Commissioner, there's been an emergency call. Garrett's been arrested." He tried to confront one of the witnesses against him, and things got physical. Henry and Sarah exchanged a glance, both shocked and relieved. Garrett's own arrogance had finally led to his undoing. As they watched the patrol car bring Garrett in, Henry felt a profound sense of justice settle over him. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, he could see a way forward. Sarah gave him a small, knowing smile. "Looks like the truth really does catch up eventually." Henry nodded, a quiet pride filling his voice. "Yes, it does." The sun had barely risen when Henry received the call. Garrett was asking to meet, requesting one final conversation. Henry hesitated, but he knew he needed to face him one last time. He arrived at the holding cell where Garrett sat, his face a mixture of defiance and desperation. Garrett looked up, his voice strained. "Henry, thanks for coming. I figured you'd want to talk." Henry remained silent, his gaze steady. Garrett continued, his voice laced with resentment. "You're really going to let them throw me to the wolves, aren't you? After everything I've done for this city?" Henry's voice was low, unwavering. "Garrett, what you did wasn't for the city. It was for yourself. You abused your power, and you hurt people who trusted us." Garrett scoffed. "Don't you act like you're any better. You and I both know this department needs officers who are willing to do the dirty work." "Dirty work doesn't mean trampling on people's dignity, Garrett," Henry replied sharply. "There's a line, and you crossed it, again and again." Garrett's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You're just as naive as they are. You think all these people care about justice? They want results, and I delivered them." Henry shook his head, the weight of Garrett's words only solidifying his resolve. "This is over, Garrett. You need to accept that." Garrett leaned back, defeated, and for a moment, he looked smaller, stripped of the bravado he had clung to for so long. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I went too far. But I can't be the only one to pay for this. If you think the rest of them don't have blood on their hands too, you're wrong." Henry felt a chill, but he remained resolute. "Then they'll be held accountable, just like you. But I won't let this department be a shield for abuse." Garrett let out a hollow laugh. "Good luck, Commissioner. I hope you're ready to lose everything for this justice you're chasing." Henry turned, not looking back as he left the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers who had initially supported Garrett now kept their distance, some avoiding eye contact altogether. Sarah approached Henry, her expression both relieved and serious. "He's done, Henry. They're pressing charges. But Some officers are shaken. They're questioning if you'll come after them next. Henry nodded, understanding the fear in the air. They need to understand that accountability doesn't mean a witch hunt. We're here to protect, not to harm. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've done the right thing. They'll see that eventually. As they talked, Officer Daniels approached them, his face tense but determined. Commissioner, can I speak with you? Henry nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Daniels cleared his throat. I wanted to say that, despite everything, I see why you did this. It wasn't easy, but maybe it was necessary. We lost sight of what really matters. Henry placed a hand on his shoulder, gratitude evident in his expression. Thank you, Daniels. That means a lot. We're going to rebuild this together. Daniels nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face before he walked away. The tension was beginning to lift, but Henry knew there was still work to be done. That evening, Henry and Mason sat together in their living room, the silence comfortable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. After a long pause, Mason spoke, his voice thoughtful. Dad, why did you do it? I know Garrett was wrong, but it cost you so much. Henry took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Because sometimes, doing the right thing means risking what you have. Garrett hurt people, son. People like you, who deserved respect and protection. I couldn't stand by and let that happen. Mason nodded, his expression contemplative. But it made people mad at you. Even the ones who used to like you. Henry looked at his son, a small smile on his face. That's true. But I'd rather have people be angry at me for doing what's right than admire me for looking the other way. Real strength isn't about making everyone happy. It's about standing firm, even when it's hard. Mason's face softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. You're brave, Dad. I hope I can be like that someday. Henry's smile grew, and he wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. You already are, Mason. You stood up to Garrett, and you held your ground. That takes courage. They sat in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them, a bond forged in shared resilience and integrity. In the weeks that followed, Henry began implementing changes within the precinct. Transparency and accountability became central tenets, and the officers gradually adapted, learning that true strength came from serving with honesty. One afternoon, the mayor visited the precinct, her demeanor softer, more understanding than before. Henry, she began, I've been watching the changes you're making. I know we've had our disagreements, but I respect what you've done. Henry nodded, grateful for her words. Thank you, Mayor. I believe it's time we show this city that we're committed to justice in every sense. She nodded, a small smile on her face. You have my support. Let's make Elmridge a place people can trust again. As she left, Henry felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle with Garrett had shaken the foundation of the department, but it had also opened a door to something better, a future where the badge truly stood for integrity. On a bright Saturday morning, Henry and Mason attended a community gathering in the park. People were hesitant at first, casting uncertain glances at Henry, but slowly, they began to approach, expressing their gratitude. An older woman stepped forward, her voice filled with emotion. Commissioner Monroe, I wanted to thank you. I had a run-in with Garrett years ago, but I was too scared to speak up. What you did, it means a lot to people like me. Henry shook her hand, his eyes warm. Thank you, ma'am. This was for everyone who deserves respect and fairness. As she moved aside, a group of teenagers approached Mason, one of them smiling nervously. Hey, Mason, the boy began. We wanted to say we're sorry. We were wrong about you. About everything. Mason's expression softened, and he nodded. Thank you. It means a lot to hear that. Henry watched with pride as Mason's confidence grew, standing tall amidst his peers. He saw in his son the strength and resilience he hoped to pass on, knowing that Mason would carry these lessons forward. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. The battle had been hard, but it had also brought new beginnings, a stronger community, a renewed commitment to justice, and a legacy of courage he was passing on to his son. In that moment, surrounded by the people he'd vowed to protect, Henry knew that every sacrifice had been worth it.